volume in the background, so don't be alarmed by that. The original audio can be muted entirely by clicking on the interpretation button and then selecting mute original audio.
好，我可以把这个普通话翻译的信息再翻译一次。如果你需要收听今天晚上活动的普通话同声翻译，请在 Zoom 屏幕底部找到一个地球标志的一个标志，就是传译的按钮。如果你点击这个按钮，是可以看到选择你希望收听的语言，就是普通话，就是 Chinese。如果你用比较小的屏幕，例如说手机的话，可能要在更多的这个功能栏中找到传译的按钮。当你在收听口译员的时候，背景会稍微听到原来语言的声音。如果需要完全正音音的话呢，你需要再点击这个传译的按钮，并选择静音原声音就可以静音。
Thank you, Grace. Before we get started, just two other logistical notes we want to mention. In addition to the interpretation, the program also is available with live captions. To turn those on, please click Show Captions button at the bottom of your screen. And if you're having difficulty with the translation, with the captions, or frankly, with any other issues, at any point during the program tonight, feel free to message ACLU-IL events in the chat, and someone will be able to help you with those. Now, finally, after a little discussion with our two guests, we're going to go to questions. You can ask and submit a question at any point in the conversation using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We'll take as many of those questions as we possibly can at the end of our discussion. And hopefully we will get to all of you. We had some questions that were pre-submitted, and I think but no doubt, I think this conversation will spur some questions as well. I now want to welcome in our two guests for this evening. The first you heard already, Grace Chan McKibben, who is the Executive Director of the Coalition for a Better Chinese American Community, and also Colleen Connell, who is the Executive Director of the ACLU of Illinois. So Grace and Colleen, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So Colleen, I want to sort of start, I think for all of us, over the last couple of months and several weeks, we've seen every day these videos and read reports and heard reporting about this aggressive ICE activity and other federal agents that have been in our communities and in our neighborhoods all across the Chicagoland area that impact all of our communities. I wonder if you could just set a little scene in terms of how you've sort of experienced and seen, these last several weeks and the kind of activity that we've seen, in neighborhoods all across the Chicago area.
Yes, it's been an abusive and performative display of power that is intended to intimidate and be cruel. And I think it was an effort to detain a certain number of people without real regard to whether the people were, as they said, the worst of the worst. It so often seemed like they were rounding up people of color. But there was an additional element of performative cruelty that I think was intended to intimidate people and to prevent people or deter people from coming out and protesting this unconstitutional behavior.
You know, I wonder if you could pick up on that just a little bit, maybe, and expand, because I think that is one of the things that, you know, a lot of people that you talk to sort of say, like, what was this all about? What were they trying, what message were they trying to send, or what was it they were trying to intimidate people from protesting about? Is it about immigration? Was it about the actions of the administration writ large? Like, how do you sort of see that?
I think they wanted to tamp down speech that was critical of the president, that was critical of the administration, that was critical of immigration policy, that was critical about the efforts by the Trump administration to consolidate all power in a dictatorial executive branch and to, usurp the power of Congress and to really uh, continue to push this country down the path to a dictatorship or an autocracy. And you could see that in the response to, by and large, very peaceful protests by, I'm just going to say, ordinary people who turned out in their neighborhoods, who turned out at the Broadview Immigration Processing Center, who turned out at various No Kings rallies, who turned out at spontaneous neighborhood gatherings when ICE or Customs and Border Protection, and I'll use ICE to really generically describe federal immigration enforcement agents, we're basically attempting to brutalize neighborhoods. I mean, we saw them fire tear gas and pepper balls at innocent bystanders and at kids.
Yeah.
And ICE tried to justify that by saying people were in rebellion or people were rioting. And as the Court of Appeals found, a expression of disagreement and by and large peaceful protest is not a revolution. It's not a rebellion. It is a protected constitutional right of people to gather and to express their views, including their views in opposition to government policy.
Grace, I suppose I want to put in some ways that, you know, a similar question to you, that I wonder, you know, how you've experienced this activity, and, you know, how, you know, at your coalition, and how, you know, you felt that across neighborhoods where you have community members as well.
Yeah. So our coalition, or also called CBCAC for short, CBCAC had been one of the organizations that coordinated, or the main organization that coordinated the rapid response efforts, or the observer efforts in Chinatown, Bridgeport, and South Loop. So we have volunteers that are on call, that would go out to the streets to observe if there is suspected ICE activities, and they have reported similar things as what Colleen is reporting, just very aggressive tactics, and innocent bystanders have been tear gassed. We had some folks joining the other volunteers at on the southwest side near Chinatown in the Brighton Park neighborhood, and were tear gassed from their cars. They were just driving towards the what seemed to be some activity. And then we also have, not specifically a person in Chinatown, but a volunteer that has worked with us before, who was performing, who was giving medical attention to someone who was tear gassed and was detained. Like an Asian dragged them away while they were trying to administer medical help to someone. So these are some of the tactics that we've seen. And then in terms of the arrests, that also instill a lot of fear because the agents seem to just come upon people going about their business. One of the cases that we know very well that happened about 3 weeks ago was a man who was standing in his own front yard in front of his own house when agents came up and asked for an ID. And the man who speaks Chinese attempted to say in broken English that his ID is inside his house and he was not allowed to go back into his house and got detained. So these are some of the things that we've seen, some examples of how terrifying it is to have federal agents on the street just stopping people and to have groups of federal agents acting very aggressively towards folks that are either bystanders or just simply observing or taking pictures, taking videos, which they have the right to do in Illinois.
I wonder if you could talk for a minute about, and maybe a little bit about the program of the rapid responders or any other programs that you did. And I'm also curious as to whether or not, you know, what you sort of tried to do in community to assuage or address that kind of fear that you're talking about, that these tactics really do, you know, foster and really do augment.
Yeah, so all of these efforts that I usually call the immigration protection ecosystem that's led by ICIR, the Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights, as well as the Organized Community Against Deportation, OCAD, and ICER as a group, and NIJC, the National Immigrant Justice Center, usually comes in on the other end if people have been detained to get them legal assistance, as well as organize some of these lawsuits to record and complain about federal agents not being in compliance with the law. So all of this belong to the same large ecosystem. The community-based organizations, as well as neighborhood volunteers, usually help with giving out Know Your Rights information, just letting people know what their rights are if they encounter federal agents, and it's the same rights if they encounter other law enforcement, that they have, you know, the right to remain silent, to get their attorney, and so on, and that only a judicial warrant would allow federal agents to enter private spaces, including your home or business, or areas in your business that's designated private. So these are some of the basic things that we do on the education front with giving people Know Your Rights information. And then the rapid response is really, when you think about it, a lot of times it's not that rapid, right? You hear about a situation, you try to go out, and sometimes the action had already passed. And then the team would just go and canvass the area and passing out Know Your Rights information again. In our neighborhood and surrounding area, that means passing out information in English, in Spanish, and in Chinese, and attempting to talk to the neighbors and to find out if there are family members or friends that can give information about who might have been detained, and get information for to the volunteers to get legal help, and then also helping the folks that are left with everything from, you know, information to assistance. So it's all one big system. Our agency is also the agency that provides Chinese language assistance on the Family Support Services, Family Support Network hotline, which is run by ICIR, again, in 12 different languages, so folks can receive assistance if they suspect ICE action, or if they have loved ones that are detained.
Grace mentioned some of these, but I wonder if just pulling back for a moment in this context, just as a reminder, what you see as sort of the top areas or rights that people really should remember in a time like this, in terms of what their legal rights are when they're confronted by ICE and by the other, you know, array of agencies that you talked about before.
Yes. So I'm going to start with rights involving detention or your freedom to not to be detained or arrested. And so, um, without regard to your immigration status, the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution protects your right to be secure in your own private spaces, like your home, your apartment, um, your place of employment. If, for example, you have a private office and it's not generally open to the public. If you work in a restaurant, the kitchen area or the office area of the restaurant. Those are private areas, and ICE or any law enforcement agent has to have a judicial warrant or your consent. You have to have a judicial warrant to come into a private space and search you, question you, or detain you. And one of the things that has been observed during this immigration enforcement blitz and has often been observed by ICE agents is that ICE agents will try to use an administrative warrant, which is signed by a Department of Homeland Security official and does not have the same force and effect as a judicial warrant. And they'll say, well, we have a warrant.
Yeah.
Let me see it. Well, we have a warrant. And they'll say, well, you have to cooperate with us. We're federal agents. And you have a right to ask to see the warrant. Ask them to hold it up, maybe against the window if you're behind a door with window panes next to it, or slide it under the door. I think it's really important, Ed, and Grace, to repeat for people that the Constitution of the United States and the protections of individual rights that are contained in what we call the Bill of Rights, or the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, protect all people. Those rights are not limited to protecting citizens. The First Amendment, basically protects, for example, the right to worship freely, to speak out, to assemble, to protest. And these rights protect people. Same with the Fourth Amendment that I just mentioned a few minutes ago. The Fourth Amendment basically reads the right of people to be secure in their home, their person, their papers, their things. And so, again, your immigration status does not wholly define your rights under the Constitution of the United States. So I'm going to move from sort of that warrant situation to the First Amendment and say, okay, the fact that you may have uncertain immigration status does not mean that you don't have the First Amendment right to protest or to speak your mind. But this is where I think it's important for people to be thoughtful about their vulnerability. And if you think that you may be at risk of detention because of uncertain immigration status, you may want to exercise your judgment and not be present at some of those public protests, because a public space like a street or Federal Plaza, where a lot downtown, or the plaza in Chinatown, those are public spaces. And police, law enforcement, ICE do not you do not have the same protective rights as under the Fourth Amendment. But, and this is another right, a lawsuit that the ACLU, in conjunction with the National Immigration Justice Center, brought under the first Trump administration, and that continues to provide some protections today, our Castanova lawsuit, restricts ICE and Customs and Border Protection from detaining people without a warrant. And these can be administrative warrants if they're served in a public place. But our Casanova case requires ICE and CBP agents to actually have a warrant before they can detain somebody, or probable cause to believe that the person they want to detain would flee or run away, but for being detained. And so those are, I think, some of the most important rights to lift up. But I want to add a warning here for folks, which is the importance of your personal safety. And so in the face of ICE saying basically, we don't care, we don't have a warrant, we're taking you in, that, what we say to people, if ICE is busting down your door, or ICE is trying to handcuff you or zip tie you, do not act in a way that's going to put you in jeopardy for getting hurt or losing your life. And what I say to people is, hard as it is, acquiesce in, even if you know that you are in the right. And we, meaning the ACLU and many of our litigation and advocacy group partners, can help you fight for those rights later on. I just don't want people to be putting themselves at risk, because what we have seen in Operation Midway Blitz is that there have been at least 2 instances of ICE shooting people, in one case fatally, and in another case it was a Brighton Park incident that Grace mentioned earlier, and ICE concocted a story that this woman was acting in such a way that ICE agents were at risk, and charged her criminally, and just this afternoon those charges were dismissed.
Right.
And if I can say one other thing, in terms of rights, and this is particularly important for bystanders, you have a right, as Grace mentioned earlier, to use your cell phone, or any other photographic or recording device that you happen to be carrying, to photograph or video ICE or Customs and Border Protection agents or any law enforcement agent when they're, conducting their business in the public streets. They may tell you that you don't have that right, but you do have the right. The ACLU won a really important lawsuit establishing that right here in Illinois a number of years ago. We're actually affirming that right. And there's litigation that the ACLU has brought across the country that affirms that right. The only caveat I would say is that if that you can't photograph or video being so close to the agent that they can legitimately say that you are blocking their ability to implement or execute on their duties.
Grace, hearing this or having this conversation about that, I always think of the early on in operations in Chicago, when in the second Trump administration, when Tom Homan went on television and said, that the problem with people in Chicago is they know too much about their rights. I wonder what you think about the role of groups like yours in terms of spreading these rights, how effective that's been, and what you see in terms of where we could do even more work to help, push those messages out.
Yeah, I think it is true that there are many, many organizations that work in different communities, and some of the earliest rapid response teams actually started in the first Trump administration and continued. So there are about 6 teams in the city and in the suburbs. and Trump won. And then that very quickly grew to, 8 or 10 at the beginning of this administration in January. And then there are more and more teams that got formed in the suburbs and even in smaller towns as we saw ICE action. But while we're very proud and happy that these teams keep growing, I can tell you that I personally recruited the first 6 people to join our team. We now have over 130 people, and most of it doubled and tripled in the past 2 months because as folks see their neighbors being detained or they see news of how aggressive the federal agents are, they want to be able to help. But that's still a very small percentage of people compared to the residents of the city of Chicago.
Right.
We still, we do, our team does monthly outreach, weekly outreach every Sunday to go to residences and businesses in Chinatown and in Bridgeport. And there's so many people who don't know, who really don't know what their rights are or still continue to believe that federal agents are only taking people that have committed serious crimes. I cannot tell you how many conversations we've had where people are like, oh no, I am okay. I came here legally, or I've been waiting for, or I know people that are waiting for their asylum cases to be their asylum hearings, and they're okay. It's only the folks that have committed serious crimes that need to worry about ICE agents. So I think that there's still a lot of work to be done. Especially, ironically, especially in immigrant communities, because folks do not always get news, or sometimes they between language and cultural barriers, and them only focusing on, honestly, just focusing on making money and feeding their families and keeping things going, that they're not paying attention to news.
Yeah.
Grace, to your point about the misinformation and the belief in ICE's claim that they're only arresting the worst of the worst, which they define as people who have committed really serious crimes, I want to give you just a very recent data point that completely, again, demolishes that lie. And I think we really need to discuss it as a lie. In our Casson and Ava lawsuit that I referenced earlier, approximately 615 people were detained in violation of that court-ordered settlement. Of those 615 people, fewer than 1% actually had any record of either a conviction or an allegation of criminal wrongdoing. And many of those complaints were for relatively minor offenses. Driving under the influence, for example. And it really, again, puts to rest the false claim that the immigration enforcement efforts are targeted toward people who have committed serious violent crimes.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. What's interesting about that, Colleen, is sort of going one level down. 4 people who were on that list, who were detained at that South Shore raid where they literally rappelled off of a Black Hawk helicopter, were listed by the government as being low risk to be released back into the community. So that action that was justified,
right,
in that brutal action that was justified as getting the worst of the worst, even the people who were taken into detention there, were not considered to be enough risk to maintain, to continue to be detained.
right.
Yeah. Again, folks, I just want to remind you that if you have a question at any point tonight, feel free to put it in the Q&A. We've got a few more items we're going to tick through here, and then we're going to go to questions. So if you have questions, I know some were submitted in advance, but we're going to go to these. Colleen, I'm going to start with you, because I think one of the things is there are, we talk a lot about the immigration enforcement activities and the impact on our communities, but there are lots of other kinds of abuses of power, fundamental tramplings of civil rights and civil liberties that impact all communities. I know in advance of tonight, we talked about some that maybe particularly of concern to the Chinese American community, like proposed changes to birthright citizenship or student visas, or other work visas that impact millions of people, frankly, across the country. I wonder how you see all of these fitting together in terms of the kinds of abuse of power that we often talk about coming from this White House.
Yes, I would put all of these offenses that you laid out under the category or classification of complete and utter disrespect for the rule of law. What we have seen is an effort to consolidate power in the executive branch of the federal government, and then to basically abuse that power, and essentially to appropriate the power of other branches of government, most specifically Congress, in two respects. One, the ability of Congress under the Constitution, actually the authority under the Constitution, to tax and to spend, which we all experience as Congress has the power of the purse. And Congress also has the power, the president does not, to make the laws. That's an essential legislative function. And what we have seen under the Trump administration is disregard for Congress's power and disregard for the laws that Congress has passed that Trump and his ilk don't like. And so we have seen broad-ranging actions that are in violation of laws that are on the books. So one of the matters that we've been involved in at the ACLU has challenged Trump's efforts to cut funding from Head Start programs under the guise of what the Trump administration wrongly claims are DEI programs of Head Start. Now, ironically, this is going after Congress's spending power because Congress has appropriated money for Head Start programs, but it also disregards the law that established Head Start, in which Congress specifically directed Head Start administrators and Head Start programs to essentially be culturally sensitive, to set up their programs in ways that reflected the needs of the diverse communities that Head Start programs were located in. And so, I mean, in some ways, it's just like Trump doesn't like it, we're going to get rid of it. It doesn't matter if Congress has a law that created this agency, or if Congress has appropriated money for these federal programs. And we've seen this across a wide range of programs, including the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which is NPR and PBS. We've seen that with other safety net programs. We've seen the gutting of the Department of Health and Human Services and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Public health, it's a perfect example of that. We have seen that in the gutting of scientific research programs that have been funded through the National Institute of Science, cancer trials, different drug trials. And again, this is money that's been appropriated, and it's been cut off because it's contrary to the whims of the Trump administration.
Yeah. Yeah. Grace, when you hear that list and when, thinking outside of the immigration things, what other sorts of these abuses of power do you most often hear about from the Chinese American community across Chicago?
It depends on who you talk to. I mean, I think different people are concerned about um, different ones of these cases that you mentioned. So,
Mhm.
for example, birthright citizenship is actually a concern among some folks, particularly folks that have been in the U.S. for generations. Interestingly, not
Right.
the newcomers, because some of the folks that have been here for a long time remembered when the Chinese were not allowed citizenship, and many people might not know that the first case for birthright citizenship involved a young Chinese man named Wong Kim Ark, who argued, whose case was argued in the Supreme Court in 1898.
Yeah.
So folks that have been in the U.S., Chinese Americans that have been in the U.S. several generations, probably even those that date back to 5 or 6 generations, that remembered such very discriminatory conditions that their ancestors faced, were more worried. The more recent immigrants are more worried about the student visas. When a large number of student visas were canceled in, I believe, February, March,
Right.
April-ish,
Yep.
there was a big concern in all the international student offices, particularly in Illinois. There are many international students. IIT, I believe, has the largest number of international students, in probably one of the largest in the country. UIC, University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign also. So I think that depends on which law affects which people, which is also what's so difficult and so anxiety ridden.
Yeah.
This whole situation is. It seems like there's a different attack every week, and folks really don't know when it's going to end.
Are you concerned? I just want to pick up on the student visa question for just a moment, because you're right. I mean, we have all of these institutions in the Chicago area and in Illinois. As you mentioned, the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. I feel disposed to point out the finest public university in the country. But what do you think is the long-term impact on students from China and from elsewhere in terms of, this sort of back and forth that we've seen over these months? It feels like we're just we're not a trusted partner in that education space any longer.
We are not a trusted partner. We're not an attractive place for international students to come. If I'm a smart, talented Chinese students, there are many other places, the UK, Canada, other institutions that are, and other countries that are much more welcoming. And so we've seen a drop in international student applications and international students after having been accepted and deciding to come to the U.S. So that is that's a real consequence.
The opportunity cost for the future in terms of the kinds of folks who would come in and contribute to our economy, to our society, it just feels so self-defeating in so many ways.
That is true. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think, to Colleen's point, this really, illustrates how this administration seems like the purpose of changing all these laws or changing all these rights is to instill fear and to terrorize people.
Yeah. So I wanted to just pivot for a moment, or sort of step down for a moment. We were talking a lot about federal policies, and I wanted to sort of step down, to think about state policies. We often think in Illinois about our state policies, for example, around immigration with the Trust Act and the fact that our state and local police don't act, as part of the immigration enforcement space with ICE and with others. Colleen, there was recently in the veto session of the legislature action on some additional immigration legislation. I wonder if you could just talk for a moment about that and kind of what impact you see, or even in terms of what it means for the state to be working on these issues to build in extra protections.
Yeah, I think that that's the frame, and that's really important to reiterate. The state of Illinois, the city of Chicago, Cook County have over the years, and we're not just talking back to the first Trump administration, the city of Chicago, I believe, during Harold Washington's tenure, enacted the first, it's sometimes colloquially referred to as sanctuary city ordinance, of basically saying, as does the state law, which is called the Trust Act, that state and local law enforcement officials will not cooperate with the feds in civil immigration enforcement.
Yeah.
We don't want our resources, our important state and locally funded resources, to be diverted from the needs and uses of the people that they serve, the people in our communities. What this new piece of legislation did was really, I think, expand that concept of safe zones to certain really important locations. Courthouses, schools and daycare centers, healthcare facilities and hospitals, um, and basic and places of worship. And so basically, these are places we're going to encourage the publicly owned places like that to develop policies to, provide safety and protection, for people who are going to school or exercising their right to access health care, to basically say, um, again, civil immigration enforcement agents are not welcome in the halls of courtrooms or in hospital corridors, for a really important and very compelling governmental reason, which is that it is in the public interest for people to actually be able to go to court, whether as a witness, as um, a victim of a crime potentially, or as a litigant in a civil lawsuit, um, and not be fearful that they are going to face immigration detention because they were doing their civil duty sometimes as a witness and responding to, maybe a subpoena or going to court. Likewise, it's in the public interest for people to be able to go to the doctor when they're sick and not worry that they are going to face civil immigration enforcement. And just to sort of complete this, the panoply of rights, um, the First Amendment protects the right of people to worship freely of the God or gods of their choice. And people should not fear that in exercising their right to worship, that they are going to face immigration enforcement. And so this important piece of legislation that was championed by many of the immigration rights groups like ICER, which Grace previously has mentioned, and IJC, which we've mentioned, the Latino Policy Institute, MALDEF, which is the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, really acted to meet the moment that we were seeing with Operation Midway Blitz.
Yeah. Grace, that's one approach, right, for state. I was thinking about, when Colleen was talking about like the message it sends when a legislature says you should be able to go to court to be a witness, to respond to a subpoena, or to go to a doctor. That's one thing. We're seeing other states take a really different approach. I'm thinking about, Florida or Indiana, where they've passed legislation that's barred certain foreign nationals from buying certain property, for example. I wonder sort of how you see some of those laws and the messages that those send, and the contrast to kind of the approach that Colleen was talking about here in Illinois.
Yeah, I think in Illinois, we're relatively fortunate to have some of these protections locally, and from the national Chinese American conversations, we've heard a lot about all these restrictive land laws. It started in Texas, and the Texas state legislature, the Democrats in the Texas legislature, led by State Representative Gene Wu, really pushed back against what he called the alien land laws, which did historically restrict the ability of certain immigrants to be able to purchase property. And it sends the message that, particularly for Asian Americans are often the target of particular stereotypes, like the perpetual foreigner. Like, regardless of how many generations your family has been in the U.S., just because of how you look, people think that how many times Asian Americans have been asked, where are you from? And if you say Chicago, like, no, where are you really from, or where are your parents from? I think the implication is that we don't belong. And some of these laws reinforce that stereotype and that sense of alienation and sense of discrimination. And I think that's why it's so difficult for people in those states.
Yeah. And if I can just expand a little bit on what Grace is saying, these laws restricting property ownership are a really old, bad, and racist idea. The birthright citizenship that Case had Grace talked about before, the parents of that man were longtime residents of the United States, but because of the Chinese Exclusion Act, they could not become citizens. And their son was born here and lived here, most of his life. And I think it's really important that we call this for what it is, because these immigration enforcement efforts, whether it's the detentions that we're seeing now, whether it's the exclusion acts that restrict land ownership, whether it's the restrictions on student visas, whether it's the restriction that Trump wants to put on legal immigration. What he is really saying is that we only want white immigrants in this country.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important not to put lipstick on that pig, to be really blunt about it. And that's the kind of essentially roundup efforts that we have seen the Trump administration really attempt in immigration or in immigrant communities of color.
Yeah. I'm really glad both of you had pointed to the case from the 1890s about the birthright citizenship, which is this thing that the Supreme Court has decided this, and the administration continues to act like there's some sort of legal argument to be made that nobody thought of this before, or that no one had considered it, as you said, when we've really argued all of these questions already.
Not only have we argued all of these questions already, but for a group of people in the Trump administration who claimed to be part of the original movement of interpreting the Constitution, another lie. And let's just call it for what it is, because the 14th Amendment to the Constitution was enacted and ratified not just by Congress, but by the requisite number of states to create birthright citizenship. and it's very explicit that people who are born in the United States are citizens of the United States and of the states in which they are born. And the case that Grace referenced that was decided in 1899 was decided, less than 30 years after the 14th Amendment was ratified. And many of the people who had written or worked for the ratification of the 14th Amendment were still alive.
Yeah.
And for the Trump administration, like you said, to pretend like there is a viable legal argument that the 14th Amendment does not protect what it explicitly says it's protecting is a race-based piece of a lie.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not that I feel strongly about it.
No, but it's a really important. I think that important point about the history of that, the fact that the actual authors, the people who were part of that debate, were still alive in 1898 and 1899 and had that role, I think is really important. But that leads me to my next question. And Grace, I'm going to start with you. But both of you have been around and working on civil rights and civil liberties and community action issues for a long time. And I know that you've seen all of these things, right? We've talked already about these are replays of old things, et cetera. But there's something about this moment that still feels different. And I wonder, Grace, starting with you, I wonder what you think that is. I wonder, how you sort of think about that in your own mind about the way in which all of these issues, which have been wrestled with before, but they feel more acute in some ways now in this moment.
I think it's the number of attacks, the frequency, and the intensity. Like ICE action is a good example. I mean, ICE was created as part of the new Homeland Security Department post 9/11, and had the same powers that it had, but just deploying these agents in such numbers to one city and having a campaign like action so that folks are seeing all this all at once. That feels very different. At the very beginning of this administration, I think sometimes people said, oh, we've experienced a Trump administration once before, it will be more of the same. And it wasn't, because even in the first week, there were so many executive orders that were signed, many of them rescinded civil rights that were earlier protected, including the right to have services in your preferred language,
right,
for federal services.
Right.
So all of this feel different. I think this constant attack, not only on the constant attack on the laws themselves, like Colleen has said, it feels different. The attack on the idea of democracy and the attack on all the major institutions, everything from universities to large businesses to the courts, everything feels very different. And that's what makes people much more worried about this administration.
Yeah. Colleen, what do you think about that?
I think Grace is exactly right. And I think it underscores the importance of the community response that extends far beyond the arguments that lawyers are making successfully in court, far beyond the halls of the General Assembly and the protective laws that are thankfully being passed. But really, it is so important for people to continue to show up and express their opposition to this attempt to destroy our democracy.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to remind people again, they can use the Q&A button in order to ask questions. If there's anything on your mind tonight that you wanted to raise, I want to I'm going to go to another question, but I wanted to raise a question we got today, and it sort of builds off that last answer. And someone wrote in and asked essentially about, some of the, forgive me, but kind of the news story or the outrage of the day, which was, that a group of legislators, federal legislators, had spoken out yesterday to point out that the military didn't need to follow unconstitutional or illegal orders. And the president, took to his social media channel this morning to declare that that was treasonous and sedition, and, essentially to call for the execution, as it were, of these legislators. And I just wonder, when you see that, I wonder, first of all, just sort of what you feel about the way in which I think all of us respond to that, but also thinking a little bit about how does the average, member of our community, average civil libertarian, see these things, as though this has just become normalized. He says this by the middle of the day. The press secretary said, oh, he doesn't really mean that. He's just being transparent. Sometimes I don't even know how to process this. And I wonder how the two of you think about these issues.
I think it's important that we, and when I say we, I mean we the people, we lawyers, we people like you, Ed, who are communications experts, Grace and other nonprofit executives and organizers, we cannot let this become normal. And we need to call this for how outrageous it is. And I'm going to get to exactly the point that you made in terms of the military. And we need to continue to express that to, I think, the more conventional media channels who unfortunately have really acquiesced in the, oh, it's just Trump being Trump, or he doesn't really mean that, or um, okay, we're not going to really focus on how that, he's, saying things that are in complete violation of the Constitution because, the American public, to, quote Ms. Levitt today, elected Trump because he was frank.
Yeah.
I mean, we just need to call it for what it is. But I want to speak for a moment about how outrageous his statement was, to suggest that Democratic members of Congress were being treasonous or seditious by reminding military members that they do not have to follow unlawful orders. The first thing is that I would say is that once again, Trump reveals his complete ignorance or disdain for the First Amendment. Members of Congress have rights to say things that he doesn't like, and that's protected by the First Amendment. To the extent that those comments occurred in the halls of Congress, they are protected by the speech and debate clause of the Constitution. But more importantly, I think, even than all of that, I say this, with great poignancy. The reason that it is important to remind members of the armed forces that they do not have to follow unlawful orders is because that legal premise is incorporated in the Military Code of Justice, but it's also reflected in international law, including the Nuremberg Accords. And it ultimately protects not just those of us in civil society who should not have to worry about the risk of our military turning its guns on us as civilians, but it also protects the members of the armed forces. Because when you think back to people who have been punished in international courts for war crimes, it isn't only, and it's often rarely, the higher ups who issue those orders. It's the rank and file who obeyed those unconstitutional orders. And so, who obeyed those unconstitutional orders or those unlawful orders, and I might say, often come home from armed conflict, and they're the ones who bear the scars of lifelong scars of crimes against humanity. And so, in one episode, Trump reveals his either disregard or ignorance about the Constitution and protection, and his disdain for laws, including international law, and ultimately his disdain for military troops, um, and um, and the sacrifices they make, to protect our country. And so it again shows what, really, quite frankly, what a disaster he is, and an embarrassment, as President of the United States.
Grace, you want to add anything there?
Yeah, I think I agree with Colleen. I mean, as I said, the worry about where our country and our institutions and our democracy stands is, to have a sitting president who so disregards the law, and to have people to have law enforcement continue to obey these illegal ways of doing things is worrisome. I think that is the worry for the people on the street, and I think they're really, folks can respond in two ways, right? Either they fold and retreat into their homes in fear, or people will have to band together to resist and to continue to push back and to continue to uphold our laws and our Constitution. I think those are really the only two choices. You can't just sit and watch.
I think when people, I want to pick up on another question we got in advance. I think when people think about that fear, I think, and I'm going to say this from the perspective of the ACLU, even though, we're a nonpartisan organization, I think a lot of things people instantly turn to is the electoral process. And there's a lot of fear about the next election and, what can be done to protect that election. And I wonder, Grace, working at the local level, and then Colleen maybe thinking about statewide and et cetera. I wonder how if you're starting to think about that for 2026 and the kinds of things that, you're thinking or planning, in your local neighborhoods to focus on, sort of protecting, again, one of those fundamental pillars of democracy in terms of an open ability to cast one's vote.
Yeah, I think so. Even we have a regular group that works with the Chicago Board of Elections and now also the Cook County Board of Elections on language access. And even in that discussion, folks have raised the question: what about beyond language access? What if the National Guards come into the polling stations? What if these other things happen? So folks are beginning to think about it. Like, if there is a scenario that can be imagined where federal agents would come and disrupt election procedures, what does that look like, and what would the local election authorities do? So I think that folks are thinking about it. I want to say, though, that there's a silver lining. We just had elections in other states and other municipalities where some of the more progressive candidates won and are able to demonstrate that the people that they represent really are rejecting the White House administration's rhetoric and narratives. So I think that we do have some hope.
Yeah. Colleen?
So I would build just very little on what Grace said, but I would encourage people to come out and vote. Because bottom line, there are more of us than there are of them. And showing up and voting is one of the most powerful ways that we can express our resistance to what is happening. And I would urge people not to be deterred by another lie that has been perpetuated by this administration, and that's the claim of voter fraud. And again, it is code for people who aren't citizens, meaning people of color by and large, whether Asian, Black, or brown. And we know, again, that this is not true. The reported incidence of voter fraud or people voting in error is minuscule. I mean, it's um, you can really literally count on two hands the number of real cases of voter fraud that have occurred, in decades. And so I think the answer is we need to show up to vote, and we need to be confident, at least here in Illinois, that state and local election officials and the Secretary of State's office and the governor's office and the advocacy groups will protect access to the polls.
I think when I think back of all this conversation that we've had this evening, one of the realities is that all of this is really overwhelming, right? I mean, it's just I think Grace talked about that, that string of all of those executive orders at the beginning, and all of the violence that we've seen in the streets in the past couple of weeks, and as you say, we were saying earlier, the normalization of the president suggesting that people ought to be tried for treason because they disagree with him. Like, this has all become normalized in this way. And I wonder about the impact that specifically has on younger people and who look at this and get frustrated about the political system, and then they don't agree with these policies, but they're frustrated. I wonder what advice you have for young people in this moment, and thinking about the ways in which they can be part of a movement to work against this. I just wonder how you both sort of think about that question a little bit.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think it's important to mark that, but picking up on what Grace said about the outcome of the recent elections, I think we did see, particularly in the New York mayoral race, lots and lots of young people turning out. And I think that's really important that continue.
Yes, I think that is the hope, right? Is to have young people be more engaged in the democracy process, or everything from elections to voicing their opinions about public policy, or trying to give suggestions on how they can improve, how the communities can be improved. I think all of this should be encouraged. I think young people. We have always, looking back, it is always the young people that help us change paradigms. Everything from the 1960s students movement and to what we're seeing today. Many of the folks that are volunteering are younger folks, and many of and we did see a greater turnout of younger voters, particularly in New York City, but all across a lot of the other elections a couple of weeks ago.
I want to remind people again that if you have questions, feel free to put those in the Q&A chat. I've got a couple of others that were pre-submitted or one more and then a wrap-up question. But if you've got a question that you haven't had a chance to ask yet, please feel free to do so. I think when I think about this, whether it's in this kind of event or, when we've been out in public or candidly, you just meet people and tell them what you do for a living, there's that question that comes up all the time. And maybe, Grace, this is a good one to start with you and from your kind of community base, is that question you always get about, well, what else can I do? What else should I be doing? What could I do? What does that look like for a community-based organization like yours?
I think there are many things that folks can volunteer to do. And I mentioned that there's this uptake of people that want to join the Know Your Rights and the rapid response teams. You can get trained. To be on the rapid response team, you need to have both the 1 hour Know Your Rights training and another hour of how to properly observe and document from a safe distance, like Colleen said, and document accurate information. So those trainings are available, and folks can join that way. And if going out to observe is not something that you're comfortable doing, joining the efforts and supporting families that have been impacted, either families that have had a family member that had been detained or folks that are too worried to go out, and organizing aid, picking up, walking the children to and from school, or helping pick up groceries. All of these pick up, drop off groceries, all of these channels are available. So it really feels like, during COVID, when everything is shut down and people are relying on each other for mutual aid, and we need to think about, going back to some of those models.
Yeah. We have lost Colleen for a second.
You haven't lost me. My video message said the internet's unstable, so I turned my camera off.
What you want to pick up the what can people do question, and we can then
Yeah, no, I think that Grace gave a number of really great examples. I would add that some of the local school patrols walk kids to and from school is really important. Um, Sometimes it may be as easy and fun as treating yourself to a restaurant in an impacted community. I mean, what we have heard from our board members and our friends in many of the communities that have been hard hit or threatened by immigration enforcement is that the commercial strips or the commercial businesses have really suffered. And go shop in a neighborhood that you might not usually shop in. Go out to eat in Pilsen, Little Village, Brighton Park, Chinatown, and really, in some ways that does double duty. I mean, it is patronizing community and vendors or businesses that may be suffering because of the immigration impact. But I also think it says something to the affected community that we are with you, and we are a united city. And we also know that when there are more observers, more witnesses, it may have the impact ultimately of dialing back or reducing some of that really abusive immigration enforcement activity.
Okay. We're gonna wrap up here, but we're gonna do something here at the end. I had the privilege recently and the opportunity to appear on the national ACLU podcast, and they ended with this question that I thought I wouldn't like. I decided I did. So I'm gonna ask you, and Colleen, I'll start with you, which is the question of what in all of this darkness we've been talking about, what's giving you hope in the future?
What's giving me hope in the future is the community response, and way in which people really, not just in Illinois, but across the country, we saw it in Los Angeles, we're seeing it now in Charlotte, in North Carolina, have really shown up to support the rule of law, to support their neighbors, and to really stand strong as they exercise their First Amendment rights and other rights. I'm also encouraged and find hope in the fact that the lower courts are standing strong. And so this is my way of backing into the question that was just posed or posted in the question and answer thing about whether I'm confident about where the Supreme Court is going to land in the birthright citizenship case. And so I'm going to say I'm nervous about that, but I think that the overwhelming language of the 14th Amendment, the precedent, and I think, quite frankly, the administrative nightmare that would be created um, by limiting the right of birthright citizenship would be horrendous. And I think ultimately, at the end of the day, and again, I'm going to hope that Chief Justice John Roberts does not want to go down as the worst Chief Justice since Roger Taney, who decided, who wrote the Dred Scott decision, that basically said that Black people, were not citizens, and so that's where I'm gonna end. I think that people care about the rule of law. The lower courts are by and large holding, and people are showing up to exercise their constitutional rights and to protect their neighbors.
Grace, what about you?
Yeah, I would echo all the things that Colleen said. It was very encouraging the past couple of weeks to see all the court cases that are in our favor, and it is, as I mentioned at the very beginning, in large part because volunteers have gone out to the street to document and record. Is because folks have been able to record all these warrantless arrests and be able to gather all this information that built the case. So you may think that just going out and taking some pictures or video recording is not that important, but it is important. And the number of people that have come out to help, and there are many different ways that people can help. One example that I can quote that's very encouraging, in Bridgeport, there was a whistle kit packing. If you know, the Whistle Project is folks have come up with the idea that to use whistles to warn each other about ICE presence and ICE arrest. So if you see ICE, is 3 short beeps. If you see an arrest, is 1 long beep on the whistle, right? And so we have this process where we pack a whistle with a little instruction sheet that is a little with illustration in either Spanish or Chinese. And there was, and the volunteers had called for an event to take place at the library. And pretty soon the library ran out of space and they went across the street to a community center. And there was a total of 100 volunteers that packed 1,000 whistle kits in 1 hour. And
wow.
That's the power of community, neighbors watching out for each other and doing something fun and communal at the same time.
And I'll say in conclusion, nobody asked me what was giving me hope, but I'll share it anyway. I've always told people that I think the most beautiful words in the English language are "we the people" in order to form a more perfect union. And in so many ways, I think, one of the things that's reflected in this administration is they're just done with the experiment. And I think what we've seen across communities in Chicago and across the country is the people waking up and recognizing their power to push back against that And I think that's the thing that should encourage us all and keep us all moving forward. So with that, on behalf of the ACLU, on behalf of the Coalition for a Better Chinese American Community, Grace and Colleen, I want to thank you. I want to thank you all for attending tonight. I want to thank the people who submitted questions in advance. I want to thank all the people who from the closed cap, who did the captioning, the interpretation, the folks on the back end who made this happen. Thank you so much. We couldn't do any of this without you. Have a great evening. Enjoy yourself. I hope everyone has a good Thanksgiving and a good restful holiday. And I hope you'll join us at a program soon.